Ladies and gentlemen, Moz-Art here. Let me show you how to replace the starter motor. This is a Volvo V50 2005 all-wheel drive turbocharged. I've diagnosed the problem to the core, and this is the replacement of a starter motor down there. So let's begin. These are all the tools that you will need. A ratchet, some extensions, some sockets, a flat screwdriver, and a wrench. Of course, hand gloves and a safety goggle. In order to reach and replace the starter motor, first of all, remove the negative key of the battery. And then the air intake, also a 10mm, the air intake hose to the turbocharged, all the vacuum lines connected to the vacuum pump, the ECU and the air filter housing, and that's all it takes to reach and to remove the starter motor. Removing the negative of the battery is fairly straightforward. Just use a 10mm socket and disconnect the battery. In order to remove the air intake, it's also the same procedure. 10mm socket. Remove the bolt. Put it aside. Remove the air intake. And its connection. I like to place back the screw where it was so I don't lose it or forget about it. For the vacuum hoses, there are a total of 5 connections. 1, 2, 3, and 2 at the back here. For the removal of the ECU and air filter housing, first we need to disconnect all the connections here from the ECU and the Mav sensor. This is the Mav Connector Sensor. These are 2 for the clusters for the ECU. And that's all it takes to reach the starter motor. The starter motor itself is held in by 2 14mm bolts, one here and another one here. For the connections, this is a 13mm nut which holds in the connector to the battery and the alternator, and also this connector must be removed. But first of all, let's remove the bracket for the ECU and air filter housing, and this is also a 40mm nut. In order to reach the 40mm nut behind here, we need to do some wiggling. Use an extension bar and a 40mm socket and wiggle your way in to the nut. Remove also the second nut down here, and when you're ready, it's done to remove the bracket. 2 nuts. Do not let the nuts drive your nuts. The next step will be to remove the connectors. It's a 30mm nut. One. And also the connector here. 2. In order to remove the last step, to remove the starter, just remove these 2 40mm nuts, bolts. This is 1. This is 2. That's all it takes to remove the starter motor. And this is the new starter motor. Actually, it's a remanufactured one. And the installation of this one is the reverse of what we've done for the removal of it. So let's dive into it. So with the starter motor into its position, you see there's a slot here. Just push it in and lightly tap it with a rubber mallet, not a metal one. Make sure the starter is completely flushed with the casing of the transmission. Now we use the 2 40mm bolts. And hand tie them into position. Use the 40mm socket to make them real tight. Now that the starter is installed, let's install now the connections, the electrical connections onto the starter motor. This is one of the connections. And the other two, the one from the bed to the battery, from the battery, the other one of the alternator. With this starter motor I received one small 30mm nut, a washer, and another 30mm nut. So I will install all 3 of them. That's all it takes to install the new starter motor. In order to reinstall the 14mm nut, use the extension as you used before, a leaf or piece of paper, so you make sure the nut doesn't fall when installing it. Place it in the socket, place a screw in it, and you make sure it doesn't fall anymore. These are fluid connections. So everything will be installed in the reverse order, starting with the ECU and air filter housing, all its connectors, the Mav sensor connector, and now we're installing the air intake hoses. These are the vacuum lines, but first of all let's install the intake hose to the turbocharger. Let's screw drive. The air intake hoses. Remember the 5 connections? 1, 2. Remember to hear the clicking sound. You make sure it's connected. 3, and the 2 behind here. 4, 5. That's all it takes to install it. Reinstall everything back, and now we reconnect the negative of the battery. And that's all it takes to replace your new starter for the Volvo V50. Why not do it yourself? Ladies and gentlemen, this is Moz-Art. Thank you and have a good one.